Welcome everyone, good morning, good afternoon and good evening. Today is Sunday, we are at the end of this week. This new week will bring us the last reset of Shadowlands, because in just a couple of days we are getting our last reset from Shadowlands. But right as we get into this new week, we have some interesting changes, because even though they are changes to balance tuning, the changes for today are a little bit more spicy, because they are going to affect something that players hold dear quite a bit, because we are talking about target caps. Of course, myself being an educator, being a teacher, I have a video explaining thoroughly what is the difference between the three types of target caps that Blizzard puts on the abilities. I am going to give you the shortest of the TLDRs, because for today, the changes to the abilities in terms of target caps that Blizzard is putting are going to be square root scaling target caps. So the TLDR with this type of scaling is that you will still be doing more damage the more targets you're adding. Unlike the hard cap of, for example, if a tooltip says you're hitting 5 targets, then that's all you're hitting, even if you're fighting 20 of them. Or the soft cap, which is hitting all of the enemies, but for the max damage of the ability. So if you're hitting 5 enemies, the AoE will be doing 10,000 damage split for those 5. If you're hitting 100 enemies, the AoE will be doing 10,000 damage split to 100 enemies. In this case, the square root scaling will continue to increase in damage the more targets you have, but by smaller and smaller amounts. This is a good example, this is a good chart of the damage being reduced more and more and more. You see that at the start, from one target to one more, the damage to each target goes from 100 to 70, and then it goes from 70 to 57, and then from 57 to 50, and then from 50 to 44. So it will get smaller and smaller and smaller increases until it barely even moves. That is the type of target cap changes that are happening for today, to quite a few of the AoE abilities of some of the specs. So let's start for today our list of balance tuning changes with Death Knight, because Death Knight is the first one that gets a change to the target caps, because the target cap in question is to Epidemic, which now deals reduced damage beyond 8 targets. They also added a bursting sword damage reduced by 10%. Now, to be perfectly honest, the damage reduction of Bursting Swords is not really that big of a deal to Unholy, because that wasn't really the main thing, the main damage source they had. It's a bit worse to get Epidemic getting its scaling reduced beyond multiple targets. Unholy was doing quite well, is doing quite well in the beta. They are not the best of the melee DPS in particular. There are a handful ones that are above Unholy, but where Unholy could keep up quite well was in large numbers, okay? It was in big AoE pools. That's where Unholy was matching, if not beating, these other specs I mentioned being above Unholy. Like, for example, I'm not making names, Windwalker and Havoc Demon Hunter. So this change is going to hurt them exactly there, which is their strongest point, big AoE damage. However, that is still not the strongest part of the Unholy's DPS kit anyways. So it's bad because it's a nerf, of course, but considering Unholy was already one of the strongest of the DPS specs, particularly for melee, that's expected. That is exactly what you expect from a balance tuning, to get the strongest specs nerfed and the weaker specs buffed. So for now, we are on course. We then continue with Demon Hunter, which does also get some target cap change, however, not what you would expect, because the target cap to Demon Hunter goes to Immolation Aura. Yeah, of course, when you think about Demon Hunter, when you think about how powerful they are and what makes them powerful, of course, what comes to mind is Immolation Aura, right? Obviously. It's not Glaive Tempest, it's not Death Sweep, it's not I-Beam, of course, it's Immolation Aura. Yeah, so the TLDR is that this is irrelevant. Immolation Aura is not even that big for Demon Hunter. In fact, it probably is a worse change for Vengeance in terms of damage than it is for Havoc. I mean, you can play with the Immolation Aura build with Ragefire, right? The ramping up damage of Immolation Aura, which can do some pretty good damage. It's still not at the same level of your main toolkit, your main, I-Beam, Death Sweep AoE, but it's definitely a good contributor, so it does hurt, at the very least, a bit, Havoc Demon Hunter, when it comes to AoE damage. Now, what is actually worthless is the other part of the nerf, which is Fell Rush, now dealing reduced damage beyond 5 targets. This is actually just irrelevant. You don't really do that much damage with Fel Rush. You didn't probably need to target cap it like this for Demon Hunter. Then we move to our first significant problematic change, because we have Feral. Tear Open Wounds is the talent which makes your Primal Wrath, so your spender which applies Rip at a reduced duration to multiple targets. Tear Open Wounds makes your Primal Wrath suck away, expend immediately 4 seconds of Rip existing on all the targets it's hitting to do that damage instantly. That was one of the main victories of Feral when it came to Dragonflight, that they had more instant damage. They weren't nearly as dependent on dots anymore, they could have more upfront burst damage. As you can see here from the damage, Rip does a lot of damage and it's most of your AoE damage, but when you look at the casts, you will find that the actual hard casts, the actual direct casts of Rip are very, very few, and the actual casts of Primal Wrath are way more. That's because that's how you use to do AoE damage. So the problem here is that now Tear Open Wounds now deals reduced damage beyond 5 targets. So this burst effect, the burst effect of doing instant damage based on the Rip existing on enemy targets, is weakened by quite a bit, because the damage is now reduced beyond 5 targets. This is of what we have seen the harshest of the target cap changes for Feral, because basically that was their only source of AoE, and that's what is getting nerfed. It's not like Havoc, as we just seen, who has like 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways of doing tons of AoE damage. For Feral, that was it. So this nerf is going to hurt quite a bit. We then move to a happier class, because Hunter only receives buffs. Just yesterday, we had our video about the state of the specs, and we mentioned that Beast Mastery was the Hunter spec doing the best in the beta. So Blizzard, watching the video, agreed with me and decided to buff Marksmanship, all damage dealt by 10%, and Survival, all damage dealt by 5%. Both of the specs right now are not doing too well. In particular, Marksmanship is in a little bit of a rougher situation. Also funny, given that Marksmanship is completely hard capped. It's not even soft capped. It has very hard issues doing tons of AoE damage on multiple targets now that they have lost things like Wild Spirits, for example. So they're hurting as a spec, and the damage buff is definitely warranted. Now, talking about warranted, it gets a little bit weirder when we look at Mage. Because while we see Frost Mage getting nerfed, which is understandable, Fire Mage getting nerfed is weird. Because as a perfect example of what we meant by yesterday's video, the fact that Fire Mage Talent 3 looked good, looked exciting, they retained tons of strong things from their previous Shadowlands version, still doesn't mean that they are OP. In fact, Fire Mage, despite having a much better Talent 3, is sort of weak right now. Meanwhile, as an opposite, Frost Mage, who has a pretty boring Talent 3, didn't change by a lot compared to Shadowlands, is still the same monotonous couple of buttons spec of before, as it's always been, was the strongest range DPS spec in the beta, together with Demonology. So it makes sense that Frost Mage is getting nerfed to their Frozen Orb damage by 15% and to the scaling, the target cap scaling of Blizzard by doing less damage beyond 8 targets. So this part is understandable. Where I am more confused about is the nerf to Fire, because Fire wasn't nearly as strong as Frost at the moment. So 12% damage nerf to Ignite, which is a big chunk, the majority of their damage. So it's quite hurtful to Fire, and I'm not too sure why, really. If I had to choose between buffing and nerfing Fire, I wouldn't have gone for the nerf, honestly. We then have a very warranted nerf, however, in the worst possible way. Because when I tell you about Monk, you're like, okay, finally, Windwalker Monk's reign of terror comes to an end. Finally, Blizzard is going to nerf them some more, because clearly the nerfs they gave them a couple of weeks ago were not nearly enough. Instead, Blizzard has this giga-brain plan to nerf Resonant Fists damage, to do reduced damage beyond 5 targets. Now, this is very, very bad. It's very, very bad because this talent in the general tree of Monk was the crutch, was the help, the assist of Brewmaster and Mistweaver to do AoE damage, or damage in general. It wasn't needed by Windwalker. In fact, Windwalker doesn't care about this talent. It's a very minor, a very small portion of their damage. It's a much bigger and much more important portion of the damage of Mistweaver and Brewmaster. So effectively, this target capping change to Resonant Fist is going to nerf the two specs that didn't need to be nerfed in damage, Mistweaver and Brewmaster, and is effectively leaving untouched the strongest spec available right now in the beta, Windwalker, together with a couple of others. That's quite a confusing change as well to Monk. I wouldn't have gone at capping AoE damage this way if I wanted to target Windwalker only. Let's put it that way. Then we have a change which is both good and bad. The change is to Priest, is to Shadow. It's good because, as we saw yesterday, the state of Shadow Priest, while the AoE damage is quite good, actually it's on the high end compared to range DPS, because right now melee DPS are in a different category. But it was like brain dead. It was broken, it was messy, it was clunky, you know, it was very bad. Now there is a change. Mind Seer is going to get target capped beyond 5 targets. And as a return, Blizzard is trying to give you a compensation buff, because now Psychic Link is going to make your Mind Blast, Mind Flay, and Mind Spike deal 30 to 60% of their damage to all other targets affected by your Vampiric Touch, instead of 15-30. So they are doubling the cleave spread damage of your generators and of your multi-dot synergy of your Vampiric Touch, by nerfing your AoE spender, which still does the majority of your AoE damage. If it ended up being not a damage loss, but it will, but if it didn't, it would be pretty good, because it would definitely spice up your rotation and make it a little bit more fluid compared to how it is now for Shadow Priest. We then have a massive change for Assassination Rogue. It looks tiny, and it has nothing to do with target caps, but Indiscriminate Carnage cooldown reduced by 15 seconds. Previously, it was a 60-second cooldown. Even more previously than that, it was a 90-second cooldown. Now it's a 45-second cooldown. This is massive, because you had this frustrating situation in Mythic Plus where you were done finishing a big pack and then you pulled the next big pack, and Indiscriminate Carnage was 10 to 15 seconds away from coming off cooldown. So you had to go into the next pack doing old Assassination Rogue damage, so tank damage. But now with this buff, it's going to make it much more manageable and much more likely that you will have this very strong AoE ability available on every pull, at the very least every big pull for Assassination. Then we have buffs for Subtlety. Subtlety was quite weak, so now Blizzard buffs them across the board. Shuriken Storm, Shadow Strike buffed both by 10%, Black Powder buffed by 5%, Secret Technique by 5%, a 1 whole minute of cooldown discount to Shadow Blades as well. And nothing to say, it's just warranted. Subtlety was doing little damage compared to the rest. Damage increase, then on to the next one, damage increase to Enhancement Shaman by 5%. So they were nerfed by 25% and then buffed by 10% and then buffed by 5%. However, the bug fixes, the fixes to some of the problems to Enhancement Shaman were actually nerfs, like for example the extra Maelstrom generation of deeply rooted elements used to last for 15 seconds when it was supposed to last for 6. There was another bug fix around, I think, Thorim's Infusion, which also gave them more damage than intended. So effectively, it was a 25% damage nerf, 10% damage buff, 7% damage nerf from a bug fix, and then 5% damage buff. So overall, it still nets out to be a 17-ish damage nerf to Enhancement compared to a couple of weeks ago. They are still doing fine, just not nearly as overbearing as before. And also they still have problems, since we are talking about AoE, about being one of the few specs to be completely hard capped at like 5 targets. They can't really go above that. So that's still a pretty big weakness of Enhancement when it comes to Mythic Plus. We then have Warlock. Now here is a quiz. If I told you about Warlock and about which specs are getting buffed and which specs are getting nerfed, and I showed you the Demonology players in the beta, and then I showed you Destro and Affliction. Now, which of these specs are the ones getting buffed, and which is the one getting nerfed? Wow, what intuition my viewers have. Congratulations, Demonology is the spec getting nerfed. Dreadbite now deals reduced damage beyond 5 targets. That's because your Dread Stalkers beyond your Felguard were your major source of damage, in particularly on big targets, on big pools where it could do this massive AoE damage, was very powerful, so now it gets nerfed. Meanwhile, conversely, the two weaker specs of Warlock, Destro, and Affliction both get buffed. Affliction gets more overall damage to Unstable Affliction compared to before. It also gets a buff to Dread Touch to make you do additional damage from 20% to 30%, and then Doom Blossom damage increased by 15%. Similarly, more AoE damage to Destruction. Imagine hearing this in Season 3 of Shadowlands. Rain of Fire damage increased by 15%. Yeah, that is the current situation of Destruction, away from borrowed powers, from Covenants, Soulbinds, Conduits, and Legendaries and tier sets. They need more AoE damage at the moment. We then finish with Warrior on the same page of Warlock and Rogue. Fury is quite the popular pick nowadays in the beta, and Arms is not so much. Fury gets a nerf to Odin's Fury, now getting target cap beyond 8 targets. Odin's Fury was a decent part of your damage, but not nearly that relevant. Of course, it is more relevant because looking at overall damage is quite unfair, because Odin's Fury is a burst cooldown, right? Is what you want to use in short periods, so it's more meaningful to nerf a big cooldown to be target capped, because it can impact your burst, which is very valuable. Meanwhile, Arms Warrior gets buffed to Executioner's Precision to buff your Mortal Strike damage, even though it's by a quite small amount, plus Blood Surge triggering 10% of the time instead of 7%, and Bladestorm damage for your AoE increased from 50% to 60%. So now we have done all of the list of the changes from this round of balance tuning affecting target caps. As we see, the harshest of the changes is definitely the one to Feral Druid, because that was the biggest part of their damage, and even technically the one to Shadow Priest, even though at the very least Shadow Priest got some compensation in return. Also, I would still say it's pretty bad, the one to Monk, because it went to hit two bystanders, you know? Incompetent Blizzard Police points the guns at Windwalker, Windwalker rolls away, and they fucking headshot Mistweaver and Brewmaster, who were just hanging in the back, not even knowing what all of that was about, so that's pretty unfortunate for those two. But overall, beyond that outlier of Feral, I'm happy to see the majority of the specs that were doing too well were the ones getting hit by target caps, and the ones that were doing badly or worse were the ones getting buffed a little bit more. So that's another positive round of changes overall for the sake of balance. You might not like to hear about target caps. Many players just have an innate hate for target caps, so they don't like to hear even mentioning them, but overall I think it was a decent round of changes. So for today, on this Sunday, I'm going to leave you to whatever else you were doing. Of course, as we close the video, I'm going to thank all of my Patreon supporters for helping me and contributing to support me and this channel as I continue to provide you all with some more WoW content. Also, you can support in other ways, which don't include having to spend money, like liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Those are still completely free methods of supporting. Lastly, for the social part of the interactions, you can follow me on Twitter, as well as subscribing to my Patreon, which will also give you access to my Discord server. Now, with this out of the way, I'm leaving. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, let's get rid of this. Darkness. I don't know what it is. I just enjoy the darkness more.